This 1905 portrait of two boys seemed ordinary until historians uncovered a dark mystery. Helen Morris had worked as an archivist at the Richmond Municipal Records Office for 12 years and thought she knew every corner of the building's vast collection. On a cold February morning in 2024, she proved herself wrong. The basement storage room had been closed for renovations for 18 months. With new climate control and reorganized shelves, Helen's job was to inventory and refile thousands of boxed documents. It was tedious work, yet she found calm in handling history. She was going through Box 47, labeled Miscellaneous Photographs 1900 to 1910, when one image made her pause. Unlike the usual city buildings, street scenes, and ceremonies, this was a studio portrait of two boys. It was professionally taken, mounted on thick cardboard with the photographer's name embossed at the bottom, J. Patterson, Portrait Studio, Richmond, VA. The date stamp on the back read October 12, 1905. Two boys, both around 10, stood side by side against a painted backdrop of columns and drapes. The boy on the left was white, dressed in a formal dark suit with high collar and silk tie, hair neatly combed, shoes polished. The boy on the right was black, wearing a clean white shirt and dark trousers, but no jacket or tie. Despite the difference in clothes, both stood with the same posture, shoulders back, hands at their sides, looking straight at the camera with serious, almost solemn faces. What struck Helen most was their positioning. They were not separated by space or hierarchy as was usual then. They stood shoulder to shoulder, almost touching, as if they were equals and friends. Helen turned the photograph over. In faded pencil, someone had written two names, Daniel Patterson and Samuel. Just Samuel, no last name. She felt the familiar tingle of curiosity. She set the photograph aside and made a note to research it later. Something about the image felt important. As she continued through the box, she kept glancing back at those two young faces frozen in time. She had no idea this photograph would lead her into one of the most disturbing stories she would ever find. Helen could not stop thinking about it. During lunch, she scanned the image and searched the archives database for Daniel Patterson or Samuel linked to 1905. Patterson was a common name in Richmond, but when she filtered by year and photographer, she found James Patterson, owner of a portrait studio on Broad Street from 1903 to 1909. In newspaper archives, she found something that made her breath catch. A short article from the Richmond Times-Dispatch dated October 19, 1905, just 1 week after the photo, carried the headline, "Negro Child Missing. Parents Seek Information." It said local authorities were investigating the disappearance of a Negro boy named Samuel, about 10 years old, last seen in the Jackson Ward neighborhood on the evening of October 16th. His parents, names withheld, reported him missing Tuesday morning. Anyone with information should contact the police. The article was buried on page 8 and only 3 sentences long. Helen had seen this pattern before. Missing black children got almost no coverage. She searched for follow-up stories. Nothing. The story simply vanished. She checked census records from 1900 and 1910 for any Samuel in Jackson Ward. There were dozens. Without a last name, it was nearly impossible. She studied the photograph again. Daniel Patterson stood beside Samuel just days before the boy vanished. Was it chance or connection? She looked up James Patterson's home address and found him in the census, age 38, photographer, living with wife Mary and son Daniel, age 10. The white boy in the picture was the photographer's son. Why would a white photographer take a formal studio portrait of his son standing beside a black child in 1905 Richmond? And why did that black child disappear less than a week later? Helen's pulse quickened. This was not just a forgotten photograph. It was evidence of something. Over the next 3 days, she dug deeper into James Patterson's background. He was not only a portrait photographer for wealthy families. Newspaper archives showed he did investigative work. Pictures of poor housing, child labor in tobacco factories, and harsh treatment of black workers. In 1903, he published a series in a short-lived progressive paper called The Richmond Reformer, showing the reality of segregated schools, well-funded white schools next to crumbling, overcrowded buildings for black children. The series caused controversy and the paper folded within months. Helen found an editorial he wrote in May 1904, "A photograph does not lie, though those who view it may choose to look away. My camera bears witness to truths that polite society would prefer to ignore. If my work causes discomfort, then it is working as intended." As a tool for reform, Helen contacted Dr. Marcus Webb, a historian at Virginia Commonwealth University who studied progressive-era journalism and racial justice. They met at a coffee shop. She showed him the copies. "This is extraordinary," he said. A formal studio portrait of a white child and a black child posed as equals in 1905 would have been provocative by itself. Given Patterson's history, this feels intentional. "What do you think he was documenting?" Helen asked. Dr. Webb was quiet a moment. "Fear," he said. "Look at their faces. Neither boy is smiling. They look serious, almost worried. If Samuel disappeared a week later, Patterson may have known something was coming. What could make a child disappear?" His face grew grim. In 1905 Richmond, many things. Black children were vulnerable to violence, forced labor contracts, or being sent to reform schools on false charges. If Samuel saw something and became inconvenient to the wrong people, he did not finish the sentence. Helen's next stop was the Richmond Circuit Court archives. She looked for cases from October 1905 involving a child witness or Jackson Ward. The clerk, Gerald, showed her the records room but warned that a 1923 fire had destroyed maybe 30% of the 1900 to 1910 files. What remained was sometimes water damaged. For hours she paged through docket books. Most cases were petty theft, drunkenness, or property disputes. Then she stopped. Case filed October 18, 1905, Commonwealth versus Robert Ashford, James Carlisle, and Thomas Whitfield. Assault and battery. The full file was missing, but the docket note listed witnesses: John Talbot, Samuel, Negro child, no surname, Emma Watkins. Case dismissed November 2, 1905. Insufficient evidence. A black child witness in an assault case filed just days after the photograph and 2 days after he was reported missing. Helen's hands shook as she wrote it down. The 3 defendants were all businessmen and property owners of standing. The case was dropped exactly 2 weeks after Samuel vanished. She found one more reference, a petition filed by James Patterson on October 20th, asking for police protection for a juvenile witness in danger of retaliation. It was denied. Insufficient grounds, concerns deemed speculative. The pieces fit. Samuel had seen an assault. Patterson tried to protect him. When that failed, he photographed the boy with his own son to create proof that Samuel existed and mattered. 4 days later, Samuel was gone. Helen needed to understand Jackson Ward's history. She contacted the Black History Museum and was connected with Mrs. Dorothy Harrison, a 78-year-old historian whose family had lived there from the beginning. At Mrs. Harrison's Victorian house, they sat over tea. Helen showed her the photograph and explained what she had found. Mrs. Harrison studied it. "A long time my grandmother used to tell stories about children who disappeared," she said. "Not runaways. Children who were taken by a system that did not think black children were worth protecting. What happened to them? Some were forced into labor contracts, re-enslaved under other names. Some went to industrial schools that were really prisons. Some were sent to other states for cheap labor, and some simply vanished. Their families never learned what happened." She pointed to the photo. "But families also fought back. When they had warning, they ran north, to Philadelphia, New York, Boston, anywhere safer. They changed their names and broke all ties." "You think that is what happened to Samuel's family?" "It is what I would have done," Mrs. Harrison said. "If powerful men wanted my child silenced, I would not wait for the law. The law did not protect black children. We protected ourselves." She brought out a worn ledger that had belonged to her great-uncle, a deacon at First African Baptist Church. The church kept unofficial records of births, marriages, deaths, and departures. When families fled north, the church noted it. She turned a page. October 1905, the Williams family departed suddenly for Philadelphia. Father Thomas, Mother Ruth, son Samuel, age 10. May God keep them safe. Helen stared. Samuel Williams, at last a full name. Williams was common, Mrs. Harrison cautioned, and they likely changed it in Philadelphia. Most families did. With the name and the destination, Helen began searching northern records. She contacted genealogical societies, Black history archives, and churches in Philadelphia. The task was huge. If the family changed their name, Samuel Williams could be anyone. She built a search profile. Family of 3, Thomas, Ruth, son Samuel, about 10, arriving from Virginia around October or November 1905. She found many Williams families, but none that matched perfectly. She tried close variants: Williamson, Willis, Wilson. In the 1910 Philadelphia census, she found Thomas Wilson, 39, laborer, born Virginia; Ruth Wilson, 35, domestic worker, born Virginia; Samuel Wilson, 15, born Virginia. Ages and origin fit. Wilson was close enough to Williams to be a deliberate change in the 1920 census. Thomas worked in a shipyard. Ruth was a seamstress. Samuel, now 25, was a clerk. They lived in South Philadelphia. By 1930, Samuel, 35, was married to Clara and worked as a postal clerk, one of the few good federal jobs open to black men. They had 2 daughters. By 1940, he was a postal supervisor, and the family had moved to a better neighborhood. Helen felt her pulse rise. Samuel had not only survived, he had built a solid life. His death record showed he died in 1975 at age 80 in Philadelphia, survived by wife Clara, daughters Patricia and Lorraine, and 6 grandchildren. But was this the right Samuel? She needed more proof. She reached out to researchers asking for living descendants. 3 weeks later, an email arrived from Brenda Collins. "I believe Samuel Wilson was my great-grandfather. My grandmother is still living and would like to speak with you." Helen flew to Philadelphia on a rainy Tuesday in March. Brenda met her and drove her to a nursing home in Mount Airy, where 94-year-old Patricia Wilson Collins lived. Patricia was small, sharp-eyed, and clear-minded. She sat by the window, surrounded by family photographs. "Brenda tells me you've been researching my father," she said. "He never spoke much about his childhood." Helen showed her the 1905 photograph. Patricia leaned forward. "That's him," she said quietly. "I don't know how I know, but those eyes. My father had the same eyes, serious, watchful, always expecting something bad." "Did he ever talk about Richmond?" Patricia shook her head. "Never. When we asked where he grew up, he only said down south and changed the subject. Mother told us not to push. Some memories were too painful." Brenda brought out a small wooden box. Inside were a marriage certificate for Thomas and Ruth Wilson from 1892, issued in Virginia, a baptismal record for Samuel dated 1895, and a yellowed letter dated October 15, 1905. Helen carefully unfolded it. "To whom it may concern, let it be known that Samuel Williams, age 10, son of Thomas and Ruth Williams, sat for this portrait on October 12, 1905, in my studio at 412 Broad Street, Richmond, Virginia. He is a boy of good character and sharp intelligence. Should any harm come to him or his family, let this photograph serve as testimony that they existed, that they mattered, that they were seen. James Patterson, photographer." Tears pricked Helen's eyes. Patterson had known the danger and created proof on purpose. Patricia pulled out one more small photo, an older white man standing in front of a studio. On the back, "Mr. Patterson, the man who saved us." "My father kept this his whole life," Patricia said. "Near the end, he told me a white man had warned his parents, tried to protect him, and given them money to leave Richmond. He said that photograph with the white boy was meant to say, 'This child is worth remembering.'" Back in Richmond, Helen researched the 3 defendants. Robert Ashford owned tobacco warehouses. James Carlisle was a building contractor. Thomas Whitfield managed a coal company. All were respected white businessmen. In a black newspaper, the Richmond Planet, dated October 21, 1905, she found a short piece. Charges of assault against 3 white businessmen had been quietly dismissed, even though witnesses existed. A child witness had disappeared, and other witnesses had been persuaded to recant. Once again, justice proves elusive when the accused are white and the victims are colored. Helen now saw the full picture. 3 white men had attacked a black laborer, possibly fatally. Samuel had seen it. Patterson tried to protect him and documented him with the photograph. When protection was refused, the Williams family fled. Death records showed a man named Joseph Williams, no relation, died of assault injuries in late October 1905. No one was charged. Without Samuel, the case collapsed, but Samuel survived. His parents' quick action and Patterson's warning saved him. They lost their home and community, yet kept their son alive. Helen knew the story was incomplete without Daniel Patterson's family. She traced him forward. In 1910, he was still with his parents in Richmond. By 1920, he lived in Washington, D.C., working as a newspaper photographer like his father. The trail led to Daniel's grandson, Michael Patterson, a retired journalist in Arlington. When Helen called, he was immediately interested. "My grandfather never talked much about childhood either," Michael said when they met. "But I found his old journal." He opened a weathered notebook to an October 1905 entry written when Daniel was 10. "Today, Father brought a boy named Samuel to the studio. He told me Samuel was in danger and that we needed to remember him so people knew he was real. We stood together for the photograph. Samuel was scared but trying to be brave. Father said sometimes taking a picture is the most important thing a person can do. 3 days later, Samuel was gone. Father tried to find out what happened, but no one would say. I think about him often and hope he is safe. Michael looked up. My grandfather carried guilt his whole life. He felt he should have done more. When he became a photographer, he specialized in civil rights protests in the 1960s. He said he was finishing his father's work, making sure people fighting for justice were seen and remembered. Helen showed him a later photo of Samuel Wilson with his family. He survived. He built a good life. Your great-grandfather's photograph may have helped save him. Michael stared. My grandfather died thinking Samuel had been killed. He would have wanted to know this. Would you like to meet Samuel's granddaughter? She's visiting Richmond. I thought both of you should know the full story. Michael nodded. Yes, very much. That afternoon, Helen brought Michael Patterson and Brenda Collins together at the archives. She laid out the photograph, the assault case, the disappearance, the flight north, Samuel's life in Philadelphia, and Daniel's lifelong memory of that day. Two families sat across the table, linked by one picture taken 119 years earlier. Brenda looked at the boys. My great-grandfather kept this story locked inside for 70 years. He never went back to Richmond and never used his birth name again. But he kept Mr. Patterson's letter and photograph until the day he died. 3 months later, the Richmond Municipal Archives opened an exhibition called Bearing Witness Photography and Justice in 1905 Richmond. The centerpiece was the enlarged photograph of Samuel Williams and Daniel Patterson, displayed with the letter, journal excerpts, census records, and newspaper articles. The room was packed. Patricia Wilson Collins had traveled from Philadelphia with Brenda and other relatives. Michael Patterson stood with them. Helen watched the two families, separated by race but joined by history, share stories and photos. She stepped to the podium. This photograph was taken on October 12, 1905. You see two 10-year-old boys standing side by side in a Richmond studio, one white, one black. In the segregated South, that alone was unusual. But this picture is more than unusual. It is an act of documentation, defiance, and hope. She told the story carefully, how Samuel witnessed a crime, how Patterson tried to protect him, how the family fled, and how Samuel lived a long life under a new name. James Patterson understood that photographs could prove existence itself. In a society that made black lives invisible and allowed black children to disappear without investigation, he used his camera to say, "This child is real. He exists. He matters. Remember him." She gestured to the photo. Samuel Williams became Samuel Wilson and lived until 1975. He raised daughters, worked as a postal supervisor, served his community. He never spoke of Richmond because the trauma was too deep, but he kept 3 things: his parents' marriage certificate, his baptismal record with his birth name, and James Patterson's letter. Helen turned to Patricia and Michael. Today, Samuel's granddaughter and James Patterson's great-grandson meet for the first time. Two families linked by courage and compassion across racial lines in one of the darkest periods of American history. Patricia spoke, voice clear. My father taught us to be proud, work hard, and never accept injustice. He never told us why. Now I understand. He learned it from parents who risked everything and from a white man who saw him as human when society said he was not. Michael added, my grandfather lived with guilt because he could not save Samuel, but the photograph they took together did save him. It proved he existed and gave his family evidence to carry forward. Both our grandfathers understood that documentation matters and that bearing witness is resistance. Dr. Webb spoke about the wider context, the legal and illegal violence that left black children unprotected, the quiet networks that helped families escape, and the progressive journalists and photographers who recorded injustice. Even in the most oppressive systems, people resisted, he said. James Patterson risked his reputation. Thomas and Ruth Williams abandoned everything they knew to protect their son. Most such acts were never written down. This photograph survived by accident in a basement box. How many other stories are still waiting? As the evening ended, Helen stood once more before the photograph. She thought of the thousands of faces she had handled in her career, most anonymous, their stories lost. Sometimes, with patience, those stories could be recovered. The picture of Samuel and Daniel would travel to museums and appear in textbooks, but its greatest work had already been done the moment Patterson released the shutter. It proved a black child in danger existed and mattered, and it reunited two families who learned that courage and compassion had linked them across a century of silence. Helen looked at the two serious 10-year-old boys standing together. One lived under his true name and carried on his father's work of documenting injustice. The other lived under a new name, built a family far from his birthplace, and never spoke of the past. Both were shaped by that October day in 1905. Both finally were remembered not as victims or symbols, but as real children who became real men whose lives mattered and whose stories deserved to be told. As people left, Helen heard them talking about their own family histories, about other hidden stories in photographs and archives, about the need to search, ask, and remember. That is what history should do, not only keep the past but light it up, connect it to now, and remind us that every person who came before was as real and complex as we are. Every photograph holds a story. Every archive holds truth waiting to be found. Every forgotten name deserves to be remembered. The photograph of two boys taken in fear and hope 119 years ago had finally told its full story. And in doing so, it joined past and present, injustice and resistance, silence and witness, erasure and memory.